For 3 years, I shared my home, my holidays, and some of my most private conversations with my mother-in-law, Eleanor. I helped her into her car after Thanksgiving dinner. I called her on Mother's Day. I sat with her at my own wedding, watching her cry happy tears during my husband's toast. Eleanor had been dead for the entire time I knew her. My name is Whitney. I'm 34 years old, and 6 weeks ago, I discovered that the woman I'd spent 3 years calling family was a professional actress, paid on a recurring contract by my husband, David, to maintain the appearance that his actual mother was still alive, a woman who had, in fact, died of a sudden cardiac event roughly 2 weeks before David and I even met, a death he never once mentioned to me, to his own extended family, or, most critically, to the Social Security Administration and the trustee overseeing Eleanor's modest but meaningful estate. This isn't a story about a strange, elaborate lie for its own sake. It's a story about exactly why someone would go to the extraordinary length of hiring a stranger to perform an entire relationship, for 3 straight years, rather than simply telling the truth, and the specific, serious fraud that truth would have exposed the moment anyone official ever learned Eleanor had actually died. I met David roughly 3.5 years ago, and Eleanor entered my life within the first few months of our relationship, the way any serious partner's parent typically does, a nervous first dinner, gradually warming into what I genuinely believed was a real, developing relationship over the following months and years. I want to describe Eleanor as I knew her, because the specific, consistent character she presented mattered enormously to how completely this deception succeeded. She was warm but appropriately reserved, asked thoughtful questions about my work as a physical therapist, remembered small details about my life across our sporadic phone calls and periodic visits. She had, David explained early on, a somewhat limited social circle of her own, a small handful of old friends she saw occasionally, no other living immediate family beyond David himself, since his father had passed years earlier and David was an only child. I understand now, with the specific, sickening clarity of hindsight, exactly why that particular detail mattered so much to how this deception was even possible. Eleanor's limited social circle wasn't simply an unremarkable biographical fact. It was, I would eventually learn, the essential structural gap that made hiring someone to play her even remotely feasible. There was no wider circle of longtime friends or extended family who might have immediately recognized a stranger standing in Eleanor's place. I remember, specifically, the first extended holiday I spent with Eleanor, roughly 8 months into dating David, a Thanksgiving dinner at her modest but comfortable home that felt, at the time, like exactly the kind of warm, welcoming family gathering I'd always hoped to eventually be part of. She'd prepared a specific stuffing recipe she told me had been in her own family for generations, walking me through the recipe's history with genuine, engaged detail while we cooked together in her kitchen. I remember feeling, that specific afternoon, a growing sense of being genuinely welcomed into David's family, a feeling I now understand was carefully, professionally constructed rather than the organic warmth I'd believed it to be at the time. I want to spend a moment describing my own life during this period, separate from the specific relationship with Eleanor, because I think it matters for understanding exactly how thoroughly this deception integrated into what felt, from my own perspective, like an entirely ordinary, functioning marriage. David and I married roughly 2 years into our relationship, in a modest ceremony where Eleanor, of course, played a visible, central role, seated in the front row. Delivering a brief, warm toast during our reception that I remember genuinely moved me to tears at the time. We built a comfortable life together over the following 1.5 years, a home we were slowly furnishing together, my own steady work as a physical therapist, David's job managing operations for a regional distribution company. I mention all of this specifically because I think it's important to understand that nothing about our actual, daily marriage struck me as anything other than genuinely stable and functional, right up until that folder of old medical paperwork first caught my attention. The first thread that eventually unraveled everything arrived almost 6 weeks ago, during what began as an entirely unremarkable task, helping David sort through some old family paperwork ahead of a planned home office renovation, work that required us to go through several boxes of documents he'd kept in storage since before we'd even met. I came across a folder containing what appeared to be old medical records, mixed in among other unrelated papers, bearing Eleanor's name and a date I recognized immediately as roughly 2 weeks before David and I had actually met at a mutual friend's engagement party. The document itself was a hospital discharge summary, though the specific medical language used throughout felt, to my professional eye as someone who works regularly with medical documentation, considerably more final and serious than a routine discharge would typically read. I remember asking David about it, casually, assuming it documented some unrelated health scare from around that time, an assumption that felt entirely reasonable until I noticed his specific, immediate reaction, a brief, tense stillness before he took the folder from my hands, somewhat too quickly, and told me it was old paperwork from a health scare that resolved fine, redirecting our conversation toward the renovation planning we'd actually been working on. I didn't push further that day. But something about his specific, quick reaction, considerably more tense than the mundane explanation he'd offered, sat with me in the days that followed, refusing to fully resolve into the innocent explanation I kept trying to construct for it. I remember, specifically, replaying that exact moment in my mind repeatedly over the following several evenings, trying to understand exactly what about his reaction had struck me as so specifically wrong. It wasn't simply that he'd seemed uncomfortable, which anyone might reasonably feel discussing an old parent's health scare. It was the specific speed and smoothness of his explanation, delivered almost before I'd finished asking the question at all, in a way that felt considerably more rehearsed than the spontaneous, slightly halting way people typically discuss genuinely difficult family health history that I want to describe what happened roughly a week later, because it's the specific detail that transformed my vague, background unease into something I could no longer simply set aside. I needed to reach Eleanor directly about a scheduling question for an upcoming family gathering, and rather than going through David, as I typically did, I decided to call her cell phone number directly, one I had saved in my own phone from years of periodic, independent contact with her. The call connected to an automated voicemail greeting I didn't recognize at all, a generic, robotic system message rather than Eleanor's own familiar voice, which I'd genuinely heard dozens of times over 3 years of periodic calls. I called David immediately, mentioning the odd voicemail greeting, and he explained, somewhat quickly, that Eleanor had recently switched phone carriers and simply hadn't gotten around to recording a new personal greeting yet. I accepted that explanation at the time, though I noted, with a specific, growing unease, that this was now the second time in as many weeks that a small, seemingly innocent inconsistency had produced an unusually quick, slightly too smooth explanation from David. I did something, at that point, that I hadn't seriously considered until that exact moment. I began quietly, carefully paying closer attention to the actual, specific details of every interaction I had with Eleanor going forward, looking, without fully articulating it even to myself, for anything else that might not add up. I want to be honest that beginning this quiet, careful observation of my own mother-in-law produced its own specific, uncomfortable guilt, one I sat with throughout the following weeks. Eleanor had, by every visible measure, been a genuinely warm, welcoming presence in my life for 3 years. Scrutinizing her small, individual behaviors with this new, suspicious lens felt, at the time, like a betrayal of a relationship I still genuinely valued, even as some quieter, more instinctive part of me understood I needed to trust the specific, accumulating unease I could no longer simply set aside. Over the following 2 weeks, I want to describe the specific, methodical process of quiet observation I engaged in, because I think it illustrates exactly how something this elaborate can survive undetected for years, until someone finally starts paying genuinely careful attention. I noticed, during our next phone call, that Eleanor referenced a memory from a family vacation I distinctly remembered her describing differently, in more specific detail, during an earlier conversation roughly a year before. The core facts remained consistent, but several smaller, specific details, the particular restaurant they'd eaten at, a minor detail about weather during the trip, had subtly shifted between the two tellings, in a way that struck me as inconsistent with how someone typically recalls a genuine, personally experienced memory over time. I also noticed, reflecting carefully on our most recent in-person visit, that Eleanor had deflected, with practiced smoothness, a specific question I'd asked about a childhood detail of David's I knew, from David himself, that Eleanor would have direct, personal knowledge of. The deflection itself wasn't dramatic or obviously suspicious in the moment, simply a graceful redirection toward a related but different topic, but reviewing it carefully in my own memory afterward, I recognized it as exactly the kind of practiced evasion someone without genuine, personal knowledge of a specific memory might employ. I remember, specifically, testing this observation once more during our next phone call, deliberately raising a different, similarly specific childhood memory David had once shared with me directly, watching carefully for how Eleanor responded. She offered, once again, a warm, generally affirming response that somehow avoided providing any of the actual, specific details a person who had genuinely lived through that memory herself would naturally include. I hung up that call with a considerably more solid, less ambiguous sense that something was genuinely, seriously wrong, rather than the vague, easily dismissed unease I'd been carrying for the preceding several weeks. I want to be honest that even accumulating these several small, individually explainable inconsistencies, I still hadn't arrived at anything resembling my actual, eventual understanding of what was happening. I simply understood, with growing clarity, that something about my relationship with Eleanor didn't add up in ways I could no longer dismiss as ordinary human forgetfulness or inconsistency. I remember, specifically, a conversation with my own sister during this period, someone I'd always confided in throughout our lives, describing these accumulating small inconsistencies with a kind of hesitant, half-embarrassed uncertainty, worried she'd think I was constructing an elaborate conspiracy out of ordinary, forgettable details. She surprised me by taking my concerns seriously immediately, telling me that her own instincts, hearing me describe the pattern, told her something genuinely worth investigating further was happening, rather than simple, ordinary forgetfulness on Eleanor's part. That validation, from someone who knew me well enough to recognize I wasn't prone to unfounded suspicion, gave me the confidence to keep paying attention rather than dismissing my own growing unease. The discovery that finally broke this entire situation open arrived almost by pure accident, roughly a month into my quiet, growing unease, when I came across a credit card statement while helping David consolidate our finances ahead of a mortgage refinance application. Among our ordinary household expenses, I noticed a recurring monthly charge to an entity I didn't recognize at all, a company with a generic, unrevealing name, Premier Companion Services, billed consistently on the same date each month, for an amount that struck me as considerably too substantial to represent any ordinary household service I could readily identify. I searched the company online and found a professional website describing itself as providing specialized companionship and personal representation services for complex family situations, language vague enough to reveal almost nothing specific about what the company actually did, but distinctive enough that I found myself unable to simply dismiss it as an unrelated, coincidental expense. I remember reading through that website's carefully vague language several times that evening, trying to reconcile its bland, corporate phrasing with the specific, growing dread building in my own chest. The site included a handful of client testimonials, similarly vague, praising the company's discretion and professionalism in handling sensitive family circumstances, language that felt, in hindsight, almost deliberately designed to communicate its actual purpose only to people who already understood, through their own specific need, exactly what kind of service they were seeking. I sat with that discovery for a long time that evening, doing the uncomfortable, escalating math of connecting this recurring charge to everything else I'd already quietly noticed, the tense reaction to old medical paperwork, the unfamiliar voicemail greeting, the small, inconsistent details in Eleanor's own recollections. I understood, with a specific, cold dread, that these details were very likely connected in some way I still couldn't fully articulate, but that felt, increasingly, considerably darker than any explanation I'd previously allowed myself to construct. I remember opening a private browser window that same evening, searching the company name alongside terms like fraud and impersonation, a search that returned surprisingly little useful information beyond the company's own carefully worded, vague marketing materials. I found, buried several pages into my search results, a single online forum post from years earlier, written by someone describing a similar, unusual recurring charge on a family member's credit card statement, a post that had received only a handful of replies, none of them offering any real clarity about what such a company might actually provide. That specific, unsettling lack of clear information, more than almost anything else that evening, convinced me I needed professional help to actually understand what I was looking at. That I retained an attorney the following week, a careful, direct practitioner named Sandra Whitfield, who specialized in estate and family fraud matters. Once I understood I needed guidance considerably beyond what my own quiet observation alone could responsibly provide. Sandra explained, once I described everything I'd assembled, that the pattern I was describing, a company providing vague, personal representation services, combined with medical paperwork suggesting a serious, possibly final health event roughly 3.5 years earlier, pointed toward a possibility she'd encountered. Rarely but seriously, in her own practice, concealment of an actual death, specifically to continue accessing benefits, income, or estate assets that depended on the deceased person remaining, on paper, alive. Sandra connected me with a private investigator, a methodical woman named Ruiz, who began, over the following 2 weeks, carefully documenting exactly what Premier Companion Services actually was. Ruiz's investigation revealed that the company functioned as a specialized staffing agency, providing actors and performers for exactly the kind of long-term, sustained impersonation arrangement I'd begun to suspect. Its actual, if carefully obscured, core business being helping clients maintain the appearance that a deceased or otherwise absent family member remained present and alive, for reasons the agency's own marketing materials studiously avoided specifying directly. I remember asking Ruiz, once she'd confirmed the agency's actual purpose, how something this specific and unusual could exist as an ongoing, apparently established business rather than some singular, improvised arrangement unique to David's own situation. She explained that while genuinely rare, this kind of specialized service occupies a small but persistent niche, typically serving clients facing exactly the specific combination of circumstances David apparently found himself in: an unreported death, benefits or inheritance tied to continued survival, and a desperate, escalating need to maintain that fiction convincingly over time. She told me the agency maintained careful legal distance from the underlying fraud itself, structuring its own contracts and marketing language specifically to avoid any explicit acknowledgement of what its services were actually being used to accomplish. That I want to describe the specific, difficult 2 weeks I spent waiting for Ruiz's initial findings, because I think this waiting period carried its own particular weight separate from either the discovery that preceded it or the confirmation that eventually followed. I continued, throughout those 2 weeks, maintaining entirely ordinary contact with Eleanor, including one scheduled phone call and preparations for an upcoming visit, all while privately carrying the growing, almost unbearable certainty that I was speaking with someone who was, in some capacity, actively participating in an elaborate deception against me. I remember that specific phone call vividly, forcing myself to maintain a warm, ordinary tone while internally cataloging every word she said, searching for additional confirmation of what I already suspected but hadn't yet had formally verified. I also found myself, during this same period, unable to fully process my own complicated grief in advance of Ruiz's actual findings, uncertain whether I was mourning a genuine relationship that might still, somehow, prove to have an innocent explanation, or preparing myself for the confirmation of something I already understood, on some deeper level, was almost certainly true. Ruiz's investigation, working through public death records across the specific timeframe suggested by that discharge paperwork, confirmed what I had, by that point, begun to genuinely dread rather than merely suspect. Eleanor had, in fact, died of a sudden cardiac arrest almost exactly 3.5 years earlier, roughly 2 weeks before David and I had ever met, a death recorded through a standard county death certificate that had never been reported to Social Security, to her pension administrator, or to the trust overseeing her modest estate. I want to describe the specific, devastating clarity of holding that death certificate in my own hands, understanding, completely, that every single interaction I'd ever had with Eleanor, every holiday, every phone call, every small, warm moment I'd genuinely treasured over 3 years, had been a paid performance, staged specifically to prevent me, and apparently everyone else in David's life, from ever learning that his actual mother had died before our relationship even began. I remember sitting in Sandra's office holding that death certificate, doing the specific, painful math of understanding that Eleanor had died just 2 weeks before David and I even met, meaning I had never, in the entire 3.5 years I'd known him, actually met his real mother at all. Every single memory I had of her, that first Thanksgiving stuffing recipe, her tearful wedding toast, dozens of ordinary phone calls across 3 years, belonged entirely to a woman I'd never once actually encountered, layered instead onto a stranger performing a role with a thoroughness I still found almost impossible to fully comprehend, even holding the documented proof of it directly in my hands. I remember, specifically, sitting alone in Sandra's office parking lot for nearly an hour after that meeting, unable to bring myself to drive home immediately, simply holding a copy of that death certificate and trying to reconcile its stark, official language with 3 years of genuinely warm memories I now understood had never actually involved the woman those memories were supposed to be about. I thought, specifically, about that first Thanksgiving, the stuffing recipe I'd been told was a genuine family tradition, understanding now that I would likely never know whether any part of that specific memory had contained even a shred of authentic connection to the actual Eleanor, or whether it had been, from its very first moment, an entirely scripted performance. Ruiz's continued investigation revealed the specific financial mechanism behind this elaborate deception. Eleanor had received a modest but meaningful monthly pension from her late husband's former employer, a benefit that would have terminated entirely upon her death, alongside a smaller Social Security survivor benefit similarly tied to her continued, verified existence. Additionally, Eleanor's own modest estate, held in a trust David was named as eventual beneficiary of, included a provision requiring a formal, multi-year waiting period following her actual death before the trust would fully distribute to him, a provision David appeared to have decided he could simply circumvent entirely by ensuring, on paper and in the eyes of everyone around him, that Eleanor's death had never actually happened at all. Sandra explained the specific reasoning behind this kind of waiting period, a detail I found genuinely helpful for understanding why David might have felt such strong, immediate pressure to conceal Eleanor's death rather than simply accepting whatever financial disruption her genuine passing would have caused. The provision, Sandra explained, was a fairly standard trust structure designed to allow time for any outstanding creditor claims or disputes regarding the estate to be resolved before final distribution, a genuinely reasonable protective measure that, in David's specific, desperate financial circumstances at the time of Eleanor's actual death, apparently felt like an intolerable delay he decided he simply couldn't accept. I want to describe something Sandra and Ruiz helped me understand about the actual mechanics of how this deception had been sustained for 3 full years, because the specific, ongoing effort involved struck me as almost as disturbing as the underlying concealment itself. Ruiz's investigation identified the specific actress David had retained through the agency, a woman working under a professional name entirely separate from her actual legal identity, someone with a background in theatrical performance who had, according to records the agency was eventually compelled to produce, been provided with an extensive, detailed briefing document outlining Eleanor's biography, personal history, relationships, and specific personality quirks, material David had apparently compiled and updated continuously throughout their 3-year arrangement to help maintain consistency across her ongoing performance. I asked Sandra, at one point, how someone maintains this kind of arrangement for years without eventually being discovered by simple accident or coincidence. She explained that David had structured the actress's involvement carefully and deliberately, limiting her actual, in-person appearances to major holidays and infrequent visits, handling the vast majority of Eleanor's ongoing presence in my life through phone calls, which are considerably easier to manage consistently than sustained, in-person interaction, and carefully avoiding any situation that might introduce Eleanor to genuine, long-time family friends who might recognize the deception immediately. Sandra also pointed out something I hadn't fully considered myself, that David had apparently been strategic about limiting the total number of distinct social contexts in which Eleanor appeared at all, generally restricting her presence to interactions directly involving David and me specifically, rather than any broader social circle of our own friends or my own extended family who might have had more opportunities to notice inconsistencies over repeated exposure. This careful, deliberate limitation of her social footprint, Sandra explained, was likely a significant factor in how the deception survived as long as it did, minimizing the total number of people and interactions that could have eventually exposed it. Ruiz's investigation also uncovered the specific financial arrangement David maintained with the agency directly, structured as a recurring monthly retainer rather than any per-appearance payment, a detail Ruiz explained likely reflected David's own understanding that maintaining consistent access to the same performer, rather than potentially different actresses at different times, was essential to the arrangement's overall believability. Ruiz also found evidence that David had, at several points over the 3 years, provided the agency with updated information reflecting genuine, ongoing developments in my own life, our engagement, our wedding date, my career changes, information the actress needed to maintain a consistent, believable relationship with me specifically, rather than simply performing a generic, static version of a mother-in-law relationship. I want to describe something Ruiz eventually obtained through the discovery process that I found more genuinely disturbing than almost any other single piece of evidence in this entire investigation: the actual, physical briefing document David had compiled and continuously updated for the actress over 3 years. The document ran to nearly 40 pages, organized methodically by category, family history, personal relationships, specific verbal mannerisms and phrases Eleanor characteristically used, detailed notes on her actual relationship with David growing up, and, most unsettling to me personally, an entire section devoted specifically to details about our own relationship and marriage, Information David had apparently updated regularly to ensure the actress remained current on the ongoing reality of my own life. I remember reading through a printed copy of that document in Sandra's office, recognizing specific phrases and mannerisms I had, in fact, witnessed Eleanor use directly, understanding, with a fresh wave of the same devastating clarity from days earlier, that everything I'd experienced as genuine, spontaneous personality had been, in fact, carefully scripted and rehearsed based on David's own detailed, ongoing documentation. I confronted David roughly 6 weeks after first noticing that tense reaction to Eleanor's old medical paperwork. Once Sandra and Ruiz had assembled sufficient documentation that I felt genuinely prepared for whatever explanation, or lack of one, he might offer. I laid the evidence out on our kitchen table: Eleanor's actual death certificate, the premier companion services, billing records, and Ruiz's documentation. Regarding the actress's identity and the extensive briefing materials David had compiled for her, I watched his face move through a familiar, devastating sequence: confusion, then a brief, doomed attempt at some kind of explanation, before finally, once the sheer comprehensiveness of what I'd assembled made any remaining denial genuinely impossible, a slow, visible collapse into something closer to actual grief. He told me, eventually, that Eleanor's sudden death had arrived at a moment of genuine, overwhelming crisis for him. He'd been managing significant credit card debt at the time, relying considerably on Eleanor's own modest financial support to help stabilize his finances, and had, in a moment of what he described as genuine panic rather than calculated planning, made an impulsive decision not to report her death immediately, worried about the specific, immediate financial collapse losing her ongoing support would produce. He described that first week after Eleanor's actual death in more detail than I think either of us was fully comfortable with, telling me he genuinely believed, at the time, that he simply needed a short delay to stabilize his own finances before formally reporting her passing, perhaps a matter of weeks rather than years. He said the specific decision to actually hire a replacement performer, rather than simply continuing to avoid the topic indefinitely, had come roughly 2 months into the delay, once he understood that our own relationship, still new at the time, would eventually require Eleanor's continued, visible presence in a way simple avoidance could no longer sustain. I asked him directly how a single, panicked decision not to report a death immediately had transformed into a fully staged, 3-year impersonation involving a hired professional actress. He was quiet for a long moment before admitting that once the initial, unreported death had gone unnoticed for the first several weeks, he'd found himself trapped by his own. I want to address directly something that weighed on me heavily throughout this entire investigation, a question I know many people hearing this story will also be asking: whether Eleanor's death had actually been entirely natural, or whether David's elaborate concealment suggested something considerably darker. Sandra and Ruiz took this question seriously from the very beginning of the investigation, understanding that a concealed death always warrants careful scrutiny regarding the death's actual cause, rather than simply accepting a family member's own account of natural causes. Ruiz's investigation included obtaining Eleanor's complete, original medical records and the county coroner's original examination findings from the time of her death, seeking independent, professional confirmation of the actual cause. Those original medical records, reviewed by an independent physician Sandra retained specifically for this purpose, confirmed that Eleanor had, in fact, suffered from a documented, pre-existing cardiac condition for several years prior to her death, one her own doctors had specifically warned could produce exactly the kind of sudden, fatal cardiac event that had, in fact, occurred. The physician's review found no indications of foul play or any inconsistency suggesting anything beyond a genuine, if unexpected, natural death. The independent physician, in her final written report, noted that Eleanor's specific cardiac condition, while serious, is one that many patients live with for years or even decades with appropriate ongoing management, meaning her death, while sudden and clinically consistent with the condition, wasn't an inevitability doctors would have necessarily predicted as imminent at any specific point. That detail added its own layer of tragic, unnecessary weight to the entire situation for me, understanding that Eleanor's actual, genuine death had been a real, significant loss for David to process, one he'd apparently never actually allowed himself to properly grieve at all, choosing instead to immediately begin constructing an elaborate fiction rather than facing the real, difficult reality of losing his own mother. I want to describe the specific, complicated relief I felt receiving that confirmation, understanding that David's actions, devastating and criminal as they were regarding the concealment and fraud, hadn't extended into causing his own mother's actual death. That distinction mattered enormously to how I was eventually able to process everything else that had happened, even as it did nothing to diminish the seriousness of the elaborate, sustained deception he'd built afterward. I remember calling my sister immediately after receiving that confirmation from the independent physician, needing to share the specific, complicated relief with someone who'd been walking through this entire ordeal alongside me from those very first, hesitant conversations about small inconsistencies I'd worried were simply my own imagination. She told me she understood completely why that distinction mattered so much, even while acknowledging, honestly, that David's actual crimes remained serious and devastating regardless of Eleanor's cause of death being entirely natural. I think that specific, careful acknowledgement, holding both truths simultaneously, helped me process this particular piece of the story in a way that felt honest rather than either minimizing or overstating what David had actually done himself to properly grieve at all, choosing instead to immediately begin constructing an elaborate fiction rather than facing the real, difficult reality of losing his own mother. I want to describe the specific, complicated relief I felt receiving that confirmation, understanding that David's actions, devastating and criminal as they were regarding the concealment and fraud, hadn't extended into causing his own mother's actual death. That distinction mattered enormously to how I was eventually able to process. The legal process that followed unfolded across several serious, distinct tracks, reflecting the genuine severity of what David had actually done over the preceding 3 years. David faced federal charges related to Social Security fraud, given the survivor benefits he'd continued improperly receiving throughout the entire period, alongside separate charges regarding the pension fraud committed against his late father's former employer's benefit administrator. Sandra walked me through the specific, layered nature of these charges in more detail than I'd initially understood, explaining that Social Security fraud involving concealment of death carries particularly serious weight under federal law, given how directly it undermines a benefit system millions of people rely on in good faith. She explained that federal prosecutors, once presented with Ruiz's comprehensive documentation, moved forward with charges reflecting the full 3-year duration of the fraud, rather than any reduced characterization treating it as a shorter, less severe offense. Sandra explained that concealment of death specifically to continue receiving benefits tied to that person's survival constitutes a serious federal offense, one that carries substantial criminal penalties independent of any civil restitution obligations. David ultimately entered a plea agreement on the criminal charges, receiving a sentence involving significant prison time alongside a formal restitution order requiring him to repay the full amount of fraudulently obtained benefits, a sum that had accumulated considerably over 3 years of ongoing, undetected fraud. I remember sitting in the courtroom during David's sentencing hearing, an experience that felt, in its own way, considerably more surreal than even the initial discovery of everything he'd done. Hearing a federal judge describe, in formal legal language, the specific scope and duration of the fraud, and the elaborate mechanism David had constructed to sustain it, produced its own strange, disorienting confirmation, a formal, institutional acknowledgement of exactly how serious and sustained his deception had actually been, delivered in a considerably more clinical, official register than the raw, personal devastation I'd been processing privately for months by that point. The trust overseeing Eleanor's actual estate was also formally notified of her genuine date of death, triggering the multi-year distribution waiting period David had specifically been trying to circumvent, meaning any eventual, legitimate inheritance he might still be entitled to would now be delayed considerably beyond what he'd originally hoped to avoid through the entire elaborate deception. I found a specific, quiet irony in that particular outcome, one Sandra pointed out to me directly during one of our final meetings together. David's entire, elaborate 3-year deception had been constructed specifically to avoid triggering that waiting period at all. Once his fraud was formally discovered and reported, the trust's waiting period began running from Eleanor's actual, genuine date of death, meaning the delay he'd spent 3 years and considerable effort trying to circumvent now applied regardless, compounded by the additional years he'd likely spent addressing his own criminal sentence before ever becoming eligible to receive whatever remained of his mother's modest estate at all. That I want to describe, briefly, the specific process of explaining this entire situation to my own parents and sister, since I think it matters for a complete, honest account of everything I navigated during this period. My mother's first reaction, understandably, focused on genuine, protective concern for my own well-being, asking repeatedly whether I felt physically safe continuing to live alongside David during the legal proceedings that followed. My father, by contrast, needed considerable time to simply process the sheer, almost unbelievable scope of what I was describing, asking me to walk through the timeline multiple times before he could fully absorb that a hired actress had genuinely attended my own wedding, presented as my mother-in-law, without any of us ever suspecting anything at all. My sister, who had been present throughout much of my own quiet investigation, found herself in the unusual position of explaining and validating this story to our parents alongside me, having already worked through her own initial disbelief in the earlier weeks when I'd first shared my growing suspicions with her directly. I found her steady, already informed presence during those difficult family conversations genuinely invaluable, understanding that she could speak to the gradual, carefully reasoned process that had led me to this conclusion, rather than our parents hearing the entire, overwhelming story compressed into a single, disorienting conversation. I don't tell this story to suggest that grief or financial desperation ever justifies this kind of sustained, elaborate deception. What David did wasn't simply an understandable, panicked mistake in a single difficult moment. It was a deliberate, 3-year commitment to defrauding federal benefit systems and his own late father's pension administrator, using a paid performer to maintain a fiction that denied me, and everyone else in his life, the basic truth about his own mother's death. If there's something practical I'd ask you to take from this, it's this: trust your own careful, accumulated observations, even when each individual inconsistency feels small and easily explainable on its own. I noticed a tense reaction to old paperwork, an unfamiliar voicemail greeting, small shifts in a retold memory. None of them, individually, felt like sufficient grounds for genuine suspicion. Together, patiently assembled over several weeks of careful attention, they revealed something I never could have imagined on my own. I think, often, about the actual woman who played Eleanor for 3 years, someone I never met directly and likely never will, understanding that she was, in her own way, also a participant in something she may not have fully understood the true scope or seriousness of when she first accepted what was likely presented to her as an unusual but legitimate professional engagement. I don't know her actual awareness of the underlying fraud, and I've made my own peace with never fully understanding that specific piece of this entire story. I've wondered, more than once, whether she ever felt any genuine warmth toward me across those 3 years, whether any small part of what felt, to me, like real affection and connection existed on her side of the performance as well, or whether it remained, for her, entirely professional and constructed from beginning to end. I don't think I'll ever have an answer to that question, and I've had to accept, slowly, that some parts of this entire experience will simply remain permanently, unavoidably unresolved for me, regardless of how thoroughly the legal proceedings themselves eventually concluded. What I do know is that I spent 3 years genuinely loving a woman who never actually existed in the form I knew her, grieving, now, a relationship I understand was never real, layered on top of a marriage I'm still working through what remains of. I found myself, in the months since all of this concluded, working through a very specific, unusual form of grief that I don't think most people ever have reason to experience, mourning a relationship that was, by any reasonable measure, never actually real, while simultaneously understanding that the emotions I genuinely felt across 3 years were entirely authentic on my own end, regardless of what existed, or didn't, on the other side of every interaction. A grief counselor I began seeing specifically to work through this experience told me that this kind of loss, mourning a relationship built on discovered deception, often proves more complicated to process than more conventional grief, precisely because there's no clear, singular loss to point to, simply a slow, ongoing reckoning with understanding that something you experienced as entirely real was, in fact, something else altogether. If this story affected you, or if you've ever discovered that something you trusted completely was an elaborate performance rather than genuine reality, I want to hear about it in the comments. I read every single one. And if you haven't yet, subscribe. There are more of these stories, and more of what I've learned about trusting my own careful observations, every day.